When I first went to the land that we now call Underhill Wood Nature Reserve, again, it was one of those experiences of getting out of the car and a complete sort of a moment of, yes, this is it. I found the right place. I'm sort of destined to be here.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World with me, Ben Goldsmith, and I'm here with my friend Jonathan Thomson, who really is a guy living the dream. Jonathan doesn't live too far from me here in the southwest, and with his wife, the author Kegi Karu, has embarked on rewilding a plot of land that is quite simply magical and one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. And what Jonathan has figured out is that you don't need to have acres and acres, a huge stretch of land if you're going to involve yourself in the restoration of vibrant nature. You can do it on relatively small plots. And in fact, arising from the experience that Jonathan and Kegi have had at their plot near Tisbury in Dorset, they're now teaching others on how to rewild plots of land anywhere from an acre up to 50 acres. Jonathan, thank you so much for spending the time with me today.
Ben, just completely brilliant to be on here. I'm in the shadow of giants. I think one of your last podcasts you had I can't even do the maths with this, but one of your last podcasts was 250,000 acres and I've got 25, and I don't know what fraction that is, but anyway, it's just brilliant to be here and it's lovely. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
The reason why I'm so excited to have you with me, Jonathan, is because people imagine that you really need enormous landscapes in which to restore properly vibrant nature, and that nature is somehow therefore away from our day-to-day lives. You know, we go up to the Highlands of Scotland, or we go across to the continent into the Apennine Mountains of Italy, or Abruzzo, or the Asturias, Cantabrian Mountains in Spain. But in fact, the challenge is to weave nature back through the very fabric of our lives, through our towns, through our cities. There's no reason why we shouldn't have nature on our doorsteps. I think it was in Shakespeare's Coriolanus that London was described as the city of kites, because there were so many kites flying above the city. And in order to do that, if we are to restore nature in the places where we actually live, we need to do it at all scales, at all places in the spectrum. And so you're pioneering something that is massively scalable. What you've done at Underhill Wood Nature Reserve is something that could be replicated in suburban gardens and in small plots of land, council land, private field corners, up and down the country. So I want to start with this, Jonathan. How did you and Kegi come to sell up and buy yourself this beautiful plot of land in Tisbury?
Let me go sort of right back, Ben. So even as a young kid, nature had been important to me. I had grown up on a very small dairy farm in the North Island of New Zealand. And, sort of back then, New Zealand had a population of under 2 million and nature was at hand. And indeed, I joined Save the Whale campaign as a 14-year-old. So it had always been something that was really important. And then as I moved through my adult life and Kegi and I met, we were sort of engaged with nature, but it was through things like, signing petitions, our subscription to Greenpeace, our subscription to WWF, things like that. And the more we were reading about, I guess, the planetary crisis, the more we felt dissatisfied with our direction. Were we actually doing things that were positive? And I took a sabbatical for a couple of years from my work to sort of think about how might I get myself back into conservation. And in fact, she's one of your neighbours. And the real turning point in the story for me was going and meeting Patricia Stanton at Cook's Farm. And I was taken to Patricia's, and I was towards the end of this 2-year journey at this point. I was taken to Patricia's farm, got out of the door, and I thought, this is it. I'm going to completely steal everything she's doing. It was at a size that I could work, and then all the things she was doing completely fitted what I imagined I would do.
Yeah, Patricia is an amazing neighbour of mine who is immersed in the world of local conservation here in Somerset. She's been involved with the Somerset Wildlife Trust for a very long time, and she has a little patch of paradise on the upper reaches of the Brew, orchards and truly wild nature across chunks of it. We've been bird watching there, and there are now signs of beavers, I've heard, on Patricia's land as well, which is exciting.
That is exciting. So that was a real turning point, and then that gave rise to a quest where we looked for land. And we had very limited budget. We're not, fabulously wealthy. And it took a while to find a piece of land. And it was sort of one of those weird things. When I first went to the land that we now call Underhill Wood Nature Reserve, I got it again. It was one of those experiences of getting out of the car and, a complete sort of a moment of, yes, this is it. I found the right place. I'm sort of destined to be here. And that was 10 years ago.
So what did you find when you walked on that land? Because when you get on the train and you head west from London out into these western counties, a lot of the landscape has been subdivided into that kind of iconic patchwork quilt of suspiciously green fields and hedges often quite closely cropped. And a lot of it's very beautiful, but also a lot of it has become quite lifeless. You don't see a great deal of wildflower colour, you don't hear that much birdsong. What did your patch of land look like when you first arrived there?
So when I first arrived there, I'd looked at countless pieces of land. I lost count. I looked at sort of tens of pieces of land within a sort of, 30-minute drive of where we live. And the things that struck me when I first arrived at what I now call Underhill Nature Reserve were 9 big veteran oak trees. So these sort of, these are sort of monumental, these trees, and they stick out on the land. So that was the first thing that sort of captured me, was that. And then the topography. So there's a very nice stream which has not been channelized and it's not been changed, and it's sort of in it's in an historical form, I guess, that runs through the center of the land. And I could just see the bones. I guess those two features, the topography and indeed the large oaks, said to me that, if we worked in a particular way, I could do something with this land and we could sort of bring it back and create habitats.
So what did you really want to achieve there, aside from just bringing back nature and sitting yourself in the bliss of the birdsong and the wildflowers in spring? What did you really want to achieve?
Actually, it's interesting. I don't do enough of that. I really don't. I very rarely sit and listen and look. I need to. I've just read John Lester Kay's most recent beautiful book about him sitting in nature. Anyway, going back to your question, Ben, it's interesting. I had 2 objectives way before we bought the land. Once I'd met Patricia and then started doing some thinking and a bit of writing about what do I want this to be. And one was, as you described, to increase levels of biodiversity, and create a sort of a mosaic of lands that would then have multiple habitats. That was one, and that sort of nice heterogeneity. And then the second thing was, I have a background in education, so it was to educate and engage people. One of the things that I think even back then I was aware of was that people are undereducated when it comes to nature in Britain and probably globally and in the Western world. And I wanted it to become a place where people came to learn about nature, engage in nature. And it's really interesting, Ben, 10 years on, those 2 aims, those 2 objectives are still the objectives which inform everything we do.
Yeah, and that's how we first met, of course, Jonathan, is when you brought a group of youngsters who are learning about nature here to my place to walk along the beaver wetland. And I was struck by the fascination in their eyes. Children just love nature. We all do, but especially children. And they don't get enough contact with it in this country. And so islands of paradise like yours that are designed specifically to welcome children and teach them about nature, I think are really vitally important. So, Jonathan, what was the first thing that you did then? You arrive, you've got this beautiful bit of farmland. I think you said 25 acres, did you say?
Yes.
And it's ostensibly a farm. You've got fields, you've got hedges, you've got a few old oaks lining the hedges. What are the first things you set about doing?
So that we had 2 major projects in the first year, the first sort of 12 months, which spanned 2014 and 15. So one of the things that the land had was a stock barn. So it was apparent to us that we could clad the stock barn and create a large room where we could have workshops and teach classes and do all that sort of thing, and indeed have somewhere for me to go and have lunch, things like that. So we spent about 9 months. I worked with a builder and we clad the stock barn and created that room. And then the second thing we did, and I'd done enough reading, there was a fantastic organization called the Dragonfly Society, and I'd read their book about the sort of fundamental importance of lakes and ponds and water, the whole idea of hydrology. So we built a small lake, a large pond. It's 97 meters long. And those 2 projects dominated that first 12 months.
What about the removal of fences and other man-made infrastructure on the farm?
It had none, Ben, oddly. It's really interesting. It's got a ring fence that runs around the property, around the 25 acres. And it was sort of semi-abandoned. Again, that was one of the things that appealed to me. So there are some internal fences that I've taken out over time, but there weren't lots and lots of fences for me to remove. One of the things that I did inherit was the previous owner, the person I bought from, sort of almost in despair, I think, had gone and got a grant to plant a deciduous woodland with trees planted 1.5 meters apart, even aged, in swamps, in riverbeds, just completely mad. And dealing with those was a significant task. I gave those away. In fact, I think now there's a woodland in Frome, which has its ancestry at Underhill Wood Nature Reserve. So that was a big task, just clearing the land. I didn't want to have a 25-acre woodland of even-aged plants.
And what about the restoring the natural hydrology of the land? Here at my place in Canwood, all of the fields were underlaid with clay and in some cases plastic tubes in order to drain the water away. And breaking those apart has been one of the most transformational things we've done, alongside the filling in of the ditches.
So, yeah, well, that's really interesting. So when we put the lake in, we broke up the ceramic land drains that ran down a hill into the lake. And they've been partly successful. And indeed, recently, Keggy and I did a visit to Wilds Woodbury and met the extraordinary Rob Farrington, who works for Dorset Wildlife Trust. And it's our next big push, in fact, is to break up more of those land drains. I've got a mini digger booked for March, and we'll do a big job on clearing more of those land drains and keeping more of the water on the land. So we did some of it, but it's interesting how this stuff evolves and you learn more and more. That's the thing I love about it. I never, ever stop learning about this.
Well, you said earlier that you didn't want your 25-acre patch to turn into just a closed canopy woodland. And that points to the central thesis of Isabella Tree's famous book, Wilding, of the work of Professor Franz Vera, this idea that through the actions of large herbivores, and especially wild bovines, the wild bison, the wild aurochs, and their domestic descendants, the native horned cattle and so on, and by their grazing, their browsing, their munching, their trampling, a kind of semi-open mosaic woodland is created, which seems to be, as Isabella Tree puts it, rocket fuel for wildlife. So that's sort of what you wanted to achieve. But on 25 acres, without those big grazers, how did you plan on going about that?
Yeah, and that's a really, really interesting question, Ben, right? So I run rewilding workshops, and I've had 100-odd people through those workshops over the years, people who own less than 50 acres. And there's an interesting perception that rewilding is about shutting a gate and walking away. And I talk a lot about the need for disruption and disturbance, and through that creating those natural dynamic processes. And so when you have a small piece of land, you have to be those animals. You've got to be the proxy. So, I play the role of the bison, I play the role of the wild stallion, I play the role of the boar, I play the role of the beaver. So, and I guess what comes with that is an underpinning of ecology. You need to understand, if you're going to successfully small-scale rewild, I think, enough of the ecology to understand, what does a boar do? What does a stallion in its landscape do? What does a bison do? And understanding that enough then enables you to interact with the landscape and create, as I say, that level of disturbance. And the other thing about small-scale rewilding, it's a lot of work. So one of the important things for me at the land at Underhill Wood Nature Reserve is volunteers. So we've just had some people down recently, and we've been sort of doing some random hazel coppicing, just again to create this disruption, shift light levels, shift the overstory. So it's about me being that proxy.
So I love that. I love the idea of you as the proxy and bringing volunteers into the land. And today we're all going to be wild boar, or today we're all going to be beavers.
Absolutely.
That's incredibly satisfying work. And in fact, it's half term at the moment, and I'm down in Somerset with my family. And we've actually played at being humans, in the sense that we've all had a pair of secateurs, and we've been cutting very large numbers of whips off the willow, off the black poplar, aspen, bit of alder, all the trees that you'd find in a wetland environment. And stacked high with armfuls of these little whips, we've been walking among a new wetland, which is part of a Somerset Council-funded flood alleviation scheme. And we've been sticking these into the ground, and we've planted hundreds, probably somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 little whips now,
Wow,
which is
nice.
hugely rewarding work. And so getting volunteers out, into nature doing this stuff is really joyful. Can we dwell upon each of those natural processes that you seek to employ at your place? How do you be a human wild boar, for example?
So one of the things that boar do is they rootle, they disrupt, the top inch or two of the soil. They do lots of sort of churning up. They manage in inverted commas plants and understory vegetation. So what I do in the woodland, is a good example, is each autumn before the dormice go into their torpor. And again, this is this thing about understanding the ecology a bit. You have to get your timing right when you're doing this. I go into the woodland and I use slashers. I use a really large hedge cutter, a big piece of machinery, scrub cutter. I use a tractor with a topper, and I use spades and forks with my volunteers, and we just disrupt bits of the woodland. And this is all done on a very random basis. I don't have any sort of set areas. What it leaves behind is exposed soil, disrupted vegetation, big bramble stands, which in shade are sort of reduced. And, that is done. And I don't necessarily do that every year. So sometimes I might skip a year. It's complete. What I try to achieve is the randomness. So there's nothing sort of ordered within the natural world. And somehow I try to get as close to that as I possibly can.
Yeah, I remember seeing a YouTube clip once, filmed from a drone above a family of wild boar in northern Italy doing their thing, rootling kind of fingers of bare earth out into the landscape. And then the same drone, I guess, from the same spot 3 months later, and it's as if the wild boar have painted colour into the landscape. I always find it fascinating the proportion of plants in northwestern Europe that really do need boar if they're to germinate and thrive. All the ephemeral wildflowers, the poppies, the scarlet pimpernel, cornflowers. Of course, after the monstrosity of the First World War, the landscape was awash with poppies because of all the bare earth. And of course, black poplar and some of the trees that we've been cutting into whips, they need bare earth in which to germinate. It's one of the reasons why the Purple Emperor has done so well at Knepp, the famous rewilding project in Sussex, is because of the pigs rootling the soil and a lot more sallow, which is willow hybrid, growing up in those spaces. And that's exactly what the Purple Emperor needs in order to produce its young.
Yes.
So you have little armies of human wild boar proxies come onto your land here and there, higgledy-piggledy, doing a bit of ploughing and disturbance. How do you make a human beaver? What do they do?
Well, actually, that's interesting, Ben, and that's sort of almost the easiest one, actually. I started out probably 8 or 9 years ago creating leaky dams, which, we all know about, sort of leaky barriers with just, sort of uprights and then horizontal pieces of wood. And I get a fantastic magazine called Conservation Land Management, and there was a paper, an article in it about 3 or 4 years ago about a thing called a beaver dam analog, where you're attempting to create something that's much closer to an actual beaver dam, and as you've got beavers, they have that sort of classic construction where they've got sort of stones and blocks at the front, covered in lots of mud. They've got vegetation at the back, creating this sort of superstructure. And so we converted the three leaky dams we've got at Underhill Wood Nature Reserve from leaky barriers into BDAs, beaver dam analogues. And they are remarkably successful. And I'll just tell you one really short story, which happened just this week. We've had a major pollution event through the stream at the land. Hundreds, if not thousands of tons of sediment has washed through. And a young ecologist who, in fact, came and resurveyed. Oddly, we were surveying the stream at the time, has resurveyed. And the beaver dam analog that is closest to the event has no invertebrates. The beaver dam analog that is furthest from the event has a baseline population. And I think that's very interesting in terms of, so what have the beaver dams done? They've taken the sediment out of that stream valley.
Yeah, and of course there are beavers now, actual beavers coming back across the southwest. They're in Cornwall, Devon, they're in Somerset in good numbers, Wiltshire, Dorset. So I guess it won't be too long before those beaver dam analogues attract the real thing, and then you won't need any volunteers, or at least not human ones, to continue the maintenance of those little dams.
Ben, I just dream of that day. I'm sort of dreaming of the day I tip up there and there's one of those pencil-shaped Nord trees. I think that, it would be sort of cracking the champagne open moment. It would be amazing. just be amazing.
Yeah, I had exactly that experience. You and I have spoken about this, Jonathan, but 3 months after I lost my daughter Iris, we found some of those little pencils along the bottom of our valley here in Somerset. And, I had my whole family here for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. We began to call ourselves the grief kibbutz, and no one really wanted to leave, least of all me. And I think it was the first time that I really felt a sense of joy and love for the world after this accident. I realized that there is a way for me to go on living, was the excitement I felt that beavers had moved into our valley. And I spent the next few weeks, well, you might even say the next 4 years, scouring for signs of beavers. And now, of course, as you've seen, you brought youngsters along to see for themselves. It looks like a string of Japanese rice terraces all up the bottom of my valley and absolutely thronging with life, carpeted with wildflowers in the spring and summer. The birdsong seems to be much more intense there than elsewhere. And we've surveyed those beaver dams and they are heaving with life. And not just the obvious stuff, the little fish fry and the amphibians and the little frogs and toads and all that stuff, but also the invisible stuff, the phytoplankton, which is the basis of all the food chain, thrives inside those beaver pools. And that's, of course, food for zooplankton and all those other little microscopic herbivorous creatures, which then, of course, are food for the smaller invertebrates and so on and so forth. So the place just sings with life. And one of the things that beavers do, of course, alongside the damming up of these little streams, is they bring in the sunlight because they cut the trees back from the water's edge. They coppice all these trees that I've been planting around my new wetland. So do you do a bit of that as well? Do you cut the material you need for your beaver analog dams from around the water's edge?
Yeah, in fact, I've just done some this winter. So again, it's this thing of this disruption and disturbance. So the answer to that is yes, we do. And what I do with that is try, and again, it's a very random rotation. I try to take plants out so I get variable amounts of light into the stream bed, but it's not clear felling. I do it sort of tree or plant at a time. And again, it's this idea that you're mimicking the behavior of the beavers. And then the other thing I do, and so to answer your question, yes, we use that material to build the dams. And then the other thing I do at random places is as beavers do, is I put vegetation into the stream bed. So the stream bed is sort of replenished over time with, branches and boughs of hazel and willow and whatever I might be cutting down. So again, it's that thing where understanding the ecology of the beaver informs how I behave.
So we've talked about two of the vital natural processes that you're seeking to replicate, that of beavers and that of the wild boar, which are, of course, nature's gardeners. What about the grazing and the browsing to prevent your land from turning into one big, closed canopy, dark woodland? You're not going to bring cattle onto your land. It's not big enough. So what do you do there? This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com.
The people who've completely smashed this are the Banau Conservation Trust. And over the years, I've worked very closely with their ecologists. We've got a thriving Banau population at the land. Somewhere upward of 30 owlets have been born on the land and fledged from the land over the decade. And they recreate a thing called rough grassland. And the important thing about rough grassland is it's a technical term where you're trying to replicate, as you've described, the sort of grass that you get when you have that extensive grazing, something like you've got where you've got one animal for 10 acres. So the way that I do that and they do that is, and this is quite technical, I cut 1/3 of each field each year. So they're on a 3-year rotation. I cut at 15 centimeters. And that's really important that you don't destroy the thatch, the understory. And then I have, again, it's a volunteer day. We do a day which I called Underhill Wood Nature Reserve haymaking. Everybody comes with a rake and we rake off all that grass. And we have, as I say, the proof is in the pudding. The field vole population at the land is just completely off the charts. It's amazing. So we have lots of barnels, lots of tawnies, kestrels, buzzards, mustelids.
What if someone had 20, 30 acres and they want to achieve these same natural processes? They don't mind a bit of unplanned or unpredictable mess, and they've got their perimeter fence, and so they just decide, look, we'll have a couple of pigs in there for a month in the autumn, let's say, maybe fatteners, and then we'll send them off for slaughter, or we'll send them back to where they came from. Or similarly, they maybe have 2 or 3 cows belong to my neighbour, bring them on, have them in the land just for a couple of weeks or for as long as it takes, and then send them off, having done their thing. Does that also work, in your opinion, on a very small plot of land?
So in terms of my own experience or our own experience with this, Ben, we don't have a ring fence and we can't afford to ring fence it. It's something I will look at in time, see if I can get funding to do that. My answer to that is yes, and it's something I've looked at. There's an issue with cattle, and indeed our mutual friend Sarah King from Rewilding Britain has just written quite a nice paper on this, about herd dynamics. So cattle require a minimum of about 6 or 7 animals to exercise herd dynamics. So if you bring on a herd that's too small, you're not replicating that herd dynamic issue or sort of dynamic for them. And that creates stress within the animal. So there's that limitation. I think the other thing you have is bringing on animals to the land that then have pharmaceuticals in them. So where they've got wormers and things like that. So one of the things I'd thought about doing many years ago was going to a local stable and getting horse dung and bringing that onto the land and trailer loads and distributing that as a way of creating that sort of invertebrate assemblage. And as one of the ecologists I work with pointed out, it will have equine pharmaceuticals in it. So there's quite a lot of stuff to contemplate here about the sort of the provenance of the animals that you're bringing on, the numbers of the animals that you're bringing on. But in principle, yes, is my response to that. And it's something I would like to move to.
Yeah, I think the point about pharmaceuticals is so important. I mean, I read recently that a single unwormed cow generates a quarter of its own body weight each year in invertebrate life. And we even put a wildlife cam on one cow pat, and it's absolutely heaving with little invertebrates and dung beetles and all kinds of things. And it's visited by frogs and toads and woodcock and all kinds of blackbirds and songbirds. So it's a really important part of the food web is to have cattle and their dung there, but not if they're wormed. And one Natural England ecologist told me that their advice would be it's better, especially in wetland environments, to have no cattle at all than to have wormed ones.
Yes.
Jonathan, when I visited you last at Underhill Wood, the thing that struck me more than anything else, I think, was the magic of your hedges. I don't know if you still call them hedges. They're linear islands of scrub. They're kind of fat and provide all kinds of cover for songbirds and other wildlife. And they're, I guess, bounteous with berries and fruits in the winter. What's the story with the hedges on your land?
Oh, Ben, how long have you got? We'll have to do another pod for this. That's become a real thing. Like, that's become something that I've really, really focused on, and for good reason. So there are a number of beautiful hedges, and in fact, somebody's writing a book about the hedges at the land and the work that we do there, and they're dating those hedges at least 200 years old. So these are ancient. These are good ancient structures on the land, and there are a number of them, and I wanted to do something with them, but I didn't know what. And one of the ecologists I work with talked me through a thing called Conservation Hedge Lane, which I've now renamed as Rough Hedge Lane. And so every year I do this rough hedge lane. I do it in about sort of 30-meter sections. I limit it to 30 meters because bats use hedges as flyways and they need those landscape markers. And what that gives rise to is just that process of laying them gives rise to the most incredible pulse of wildlife. So a young graduate ecologist, about how many years ago did Harry do this? About 3 or 4 years ago, did his dissertation on our hedges. And the data is quite complex, but sort of rounding all the data up, what we're showing is you get a 2-fold increase in invertebrate life in 4 years, which is just extraordinary. And so this has become something I replicate all over the land. In fact, I'm going to do some hedge laying on Thursday. I'm going to lay another section. And the goal is that I get all those hedges laid before I get too old, because there's a lot of them. And once they're done, I can leave them. I probably won't touch them again in my lifetime. I'll probably just leave them as they are. And I guess why a hedge is so important. So if we go back to our sort of prehistory, when we had this sort of mosaic of scrubland, and indeed through things like the Enclosures Act, all that scrub was cleared. The hedge is a proxy for all that scrubland. It's got the hawthorn, it's got the blackthorn, it's got holly, it's got wild rose. So all of those plants that were part of that mosaic landscape were gathered up accidentally. It's a really interesting accident of natural history to have all those plants gathered up in these linear strips. And so, it's this very nice representation, this very nice sort of facsimile for this ancient land that existed. And conservation hedge laying it completely is off the scale.
I mean, your hedges are just so different from what we're used to seeing in the English landscape. Most hedges nowadays are machine cut, which leaves them pretty bare, not great in terms of cover for wildlife. And of course, it deprives them of their berries, which only really start growing in the second or third year after they were last cut or laid. So this practice of laying them and then leaving them used to be ubiquitous. I mean, that's what farms did. They cut them and did so on roughly a 9 or 10 year cycle. And the result would have been these burgeoning, fat hedges crisscrossing our landscapes as far as the eye could see. For me, I think that's one of the most important parts of what you do at Underhill Wood. And for me, that was kind of the magic sauce, with these extraordinarily rich and diverse hedges. Although they didn't really look like hedges, they looked like these kind of battleships, or they look like linear islands of kind of fat scrub crisscrossing your beautiful plot of land. And Jonathan, when we go walking together on your place, you've always got a bucket of something or other. I mean, you're not just doing stuff that is kind of changing the landscape. You're also feeding animals and doing things, which I think is probably part of the joy of it. We do that kind of stuff here in Canwood. Tell me about that. What about the meat and the bones and those kind of things that you had in your hand when I was last there?
Well, actually, it's interesting. I got this from Isabella. I got this from Wilding. Isabella Tree. So one of the things that she laments in Wilding is the fact that they can't leave animals to die in the landscape and to rot. And then I started reading some papers about the whole role of carcasses, and some fantastic books about the role of carcasses and the cycle of life and the role they play. And if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, for example, a truly wild landscape, the carcasses play a fundamental role in the driving of those ecosystems. So it's me being the wolf. It's me being the wolf. So I will stop. Actually, I had a fantastic experience not so long ago of being stuck on the A36 trying to get a roe deer in the back of the car with everyone backed up and sort of, beeping their horn at me and sort of abusing me as they drove past. And then I bring those animals onto the land. And sometimes, it's really interesting, sometimes I leave them whole and I don't touch them. And what tends to happen then is invertebrates move in. But if I open them up, sometimes I do a bit of sort of basic butchery on them. Then you get the badgers and the robins, and so I put trail cameras on them, and the magpies. And interestingly, you get things like buzzards will come deep into the woods to scavenge on this. So that is something that's become a feature, is bringing this stuff onto the land. And the interesting thing, Ben, I've been doing this now for 8 years, I'm yet to find a single bone. So I never find it. These things just completely vanish. I don't know where they go. I don't know where the skulls go. I don't know where the femurs go. I don't know where the pelvises go. I just never find a single bone. It just miraculously gets subsumed into the landscape.
Jonathan, you've started doing webinars and other things to guide people on how to do rewilding at a smaller scale. I really urge anyone listening to this podcast to look up the Underhill Wood Nature Reserve webinars and to read stuff that Jonathan's written, because it's fascinating and it's joyful. And I think that if you could just give thought to one thing, if you have savings, you want to invest them in something great, a big cruise, or maybe a fast car, or the other kind of things that you might buy in retirement or whatever. Think instead about buying 10 acres, 5 acres, 25 acres, 50 acres, somewhere not far from where you live, and creating magic in the way that Jonathan and Keggy have done. I mean, it is just extraordinary. If you're in the Dorset area, go and have a look at Underhill Wood Nature Reserve. They'll probably find a queue at the entrance now. It's becoming more and more well known. But it's certainly for me, I've been privileged enough to have a slice of land in South Somerset, and rewilding this land here has been really the joy of my life. And I know Jonathan feels the same about his plot. And I urge you to give some thought to doing this yourself in whatever scale you can. Even a suburban garden is extremely important habitat for all kinds of species, and you can replicate these processes at a very, very small scale. Now, someone once said to me that all you really need are dead wood, scrub, and a bit of water. Well, add to those some of these dynamic...
That's it.
Yeah, and add to these some of these dynamic processes, and you will create magic. And then you will sit in it. And who needs meditation or church when you can sit in a little patch of your own wild nature? Jonathan, thank you so much for giving me your time. I really love what you do. I love you and Keggy so much. I feel really privileged to call myself your friend, and I hope to see you very soon.
Well, Ben, it's completely reciprocated. You're an unrelenting in the best possible way champion for nature. And, I salute you for that. You do extraordinary work. So thank you. And what a privilege to be part on this podcast. Amazing. Just amazing.
Some people are lucky enough to have a bit of land in which they can get busy restoring nature, rewilding. Some have got gardens. And Jonathan here has really been a pioneer of figuring out how to rewild such areas. And what a joy it is to have heard him describe it. But everyone can get involved in rewilding. There's loads of opportunities to volunteer and participate near you. Just look for them and you'll find them. If you've enjoyed the episode, please go onto whatever platform you use, give us a like, share it with your friends. It all makes a big difference. Thank you. In the next episode, I'm going to be talking to Melpo Apostolidou from BirdLife Cyprus, specifically about Melpo's project to reintroduce griffon vultures to the island of Cyprus, bringing them in crates from Spain. It's an amazing project. I hope you'll join us.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about a series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.